Hey, welcome. Dooovid here. Having an interesting discussion with a man goes by the Faustian Spirit, involved in politics and helping people get elected, run for local offices. In many ways, we're on the exact opposite side of many issues. We have many points of agreement, many points of strong disagreement. But I think the main difference would be that we're on the opposite end of the blue-red divide. And this man's a philosopher. He's been in public office and has a lot of thought. We've talked and been on similar streams. So to anybody watching, allow Faustian to just give whatever bio he wants to give.
Hello, and thank you for having me, Dooovid. Yeah, so I've been involved in mostly local politics for well over a decade now. I got my feet wet through the Ron Paul revolution, and the day the day he announced he was running for president, I woke up early to watch it live. I distinctly remember this, and I created a meetup group to watch the first presidential debates. And through that, I built up a very large volunteer base as time went on. I'll spare you some of the details, but it grew very quickly, and we started pooling our money and proactively campaigning in my county. And through my interaction with the other presidential candidates, like volunteer squads, as well as the local GOP, I started learning their bureaucratic system of government, essentially. They're very rules oriented, very structure oriented. Like all the government offices are there because of legislation, and then there's like all the building codes and all the various rules structures that make up, say, the county clerk's office. And then from there, understanding how they structured the political system locally. Like, for instance, I learned how the Democrats and the Republicans make deals with one another to exclude third parties from elections. Like, I learned that firsthand, reading the documents, talking to the people. There's like the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And learning my local political landscape, identifying political weaknesses within the GOP, we were able to nearly take the 51% margin to gain control over the county GOP. And we did that through, if you're familiar with the political structure, through precinct committee officers electing district representatives to the county government. In turn, those people were the ones who nominated the chairman, the secretary, etc. And although we didn't get the majority, we got key positions of power within the county GOP. And it also allowed us political cover to get more quote unquote patriotic libertarian Americans to be able to participate in primary debates. So, and it's through this process that I won 2 elections. And by interfacing with the system, learning the system.
As a Republican or libertarian?
As a Republican. Yeah, absolutely.
I was actually involved in the Ron Paul campaign in 2008, and I was always libertarian. When I turned 18, I registered as a libertarian and voted libertarian. That was the last time I voted. My leanings were largely to the right, mostly small government, minimal interference. However, on certain issues, I'm very liberal, and obviously Metro Detroit, it's basically impossible for anyone but a Democrat to win office. My mother's lawyer at a major firm in Detroit. I was bureaucratic by nature, so I understood paperwork. I've worked as a building permit technician. I worked previously filling out paperwork for people to get food stamps. And Medicare, Medicaid. I knew government bureaucracy. I never liked filling those positions myself, maybe because my mother was a lawyer as a kid, so I kind of saw that people were on top of politicians, that politicians get paid less or they have to be corrupt to get paid more. So you could be more powerful, maybe so to say, as a lobbyist. Even when I was younger, I kind of wanted to be a lobbyist, even though they're very unpopular. Still till today, I'm not a registered lobbyist, but that's probably more accurate to consider myself a lobbyist. But I'm very good with paperwork, and I'm constantly helping people, petitions, get things on the ballot, teaching them how to fill out paperwork or meet regulations or even fundraising. And you could see on my YouTube page, I have multiple people that I've been involved in their election campaigns. As a religious man, I've decided it's best to be nonpartisan, although I have strong opinions on different issues. Um, I'm not I never support candidates one way or another. I support them running and doing what's necessary to get on the ballot. But in terms of campaigns, I don't endorse candidates, and you think it's best for religious people to avoid that. And there's a certain clearness of mind that comes from not picking a side in that. But obviously, here in Metro Detroit, um, we're on opposite sides of many issues. From what I understand, you're not a big fan of immigration. You're not a big fan of the demographic shift in America. As we're in Metro Detroit, I'm pretty pro-immigration. Almost everyone in Detroit is pro-immigration. We're a refugee city. We've bucked President Trump on these things, and we have a record number of immigrants, first-time immigrants, people new to America. The famous Rashida Tlaib, Palestinian woman that a lot of people in the Jewish community are hesitant about. I supported her running, and she won. She came to the synagogue that I go to. Abdul al-Sayed, the youngest Muslim to run for governor, he came to our synagogue. It's up on YouTube. I'm avowed to the process. So in that essence, I support people that are avowed to the process, even if they politically oppose me. But unless you want to add anything more to that, we could go straight into the more theoretical topic that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and I think I think what I have to offer is a nice segue into that as well. I don't necessarily view someone who works on the other side of the aisle a as a combatant, so to speak. Like I very much dislike a lot of the confrontational approach to politics, especially these days. So I like to look at the other political factions, even within the right, as just competitors. Look, advocating for their interests, what's in their best interests.
Well,
What
we
they,
might move into. You live in an area that has very few Jews.
yeah, very few.
So I mean, we mentioned in some of this.
Period.
Yeah, in some of the streams you've been mentioning the Jewish influence in politics, and so even though I don't vote, I'm active in Jewish issues in politics. I'm not an actual lobbyist, but I know most of the people in our community on all sides of the issues that lobby on any sort of issue. So if you were elected in an area that had a Jewish population, presumably those Jews would be coming to you and wanting their concerns addressed. And as your constituents reach larger and larger audiences, eventually they'll be in areas that have Jewish constituents, or even on a federal level where they vote within the federal government, where it's something that it might affect Israel. You would probably have Jewish constituents that would reach out to you. And we've mentioned that on other streams. If you want to talk about that, or you want to go straight into the theoretical discussions.
Yeah, well, the reason why I see a connection here is because of this concept of quote unquote liberty and the non aggression principle. It has created very unnatural situations, in my opinion, where for some reason, a less than 1% of the population has an inordinate amount of power and influence over what is or is not acceptable conversation to be had in public, what is or is not even a crime now. and I mean more than outside of just specifically the Jewish population. For example, advocating for rights for illegal people is like I don't understand how a moral person could attempt to even make that argument, or someone who is advocating for interests that while they may be competing, yes, I also recognize they will do damage to my interests. So what is the best way to negotiate these conflicts between interests, ideology, culture, race, biology, etc.? And I think one of the linchpin issues here is these two concepts, the non-aggression principle and liberty. And something I found interesting was mentioning the non-aggression principle to you. Like, what was your initial reaction to that, and what is your view on the NAP?
People who follow my channel know that I've somewhat became a Hindu, and so when you first mentioned non-aggression principle, I thought you were talking about ahimsa, which means non-violence, which is Hindu Jain concept. And even from reading what you said, chances are it might be. And looking at Wikipedia, the history of it, I wouldn't be surprised if the Western thinkers who came up with non-aggression had directly received their ideas from India, but I don't think that's necessarily what you meant.
Well, I mean, there's like a history of Quakerism I'm sure you're familiar with, and say like the Amish and the Mennonites and their views of nonviolence. There's many quote unquote non-aggression principles that I see in various religious sects all across the world.
It'd be a matter for a separate, more intellectual, historic background, because say most of those movements start in Europe after Europe starts trading in India. So when Europe reaches India in the 1400s, and then by the 1600s, there's a massive trade network between India and the West, that those ideas entered the West through India. So even like Quakers and stuff past the Protestant Reformation, those people would have been familiar with Hindu Indian thought and the archaeological evidence that clearly the Hindu scriptures can be traced at least 2,000 years old, maybe far back, as where these ideas in Europe seem to not be found more than 500 years ago.
I disagree with that. I think there's a good case to be made for advocacy of non-aggression, advocacy of the reasons why it's not in your self-interest to initiate violence. Like, there's plenty of discussion around that concept dating all the way back to Greece. So, and not only that, but the reason why I say I see it in multiple cultures is, for instance, some of the more, I guess you could say, esoteric Chinese cultures, like the Taoist scholars in particular, talking about the merits of non-aggression. And to my knowledge, they weren't given those ideas by Hinduism. So
yeah, it might be semi off topic, although it is interesting for academic research. And I have a strong background in Hinduism, so when you mentioned that to me, I initially was thinking the Hindu idea, although I am familiar with the idea in the West. And generally, I'm a subscriber to the non-aggression principle. If you're thinking like Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, that Dr. King had sent people to India to research Gandhi's what they call satyagraha, which was their movement of passive resistance. And if we're talking group evolutionary strategy type, where you mentioned like Jews being a very small minority, having a certain strategy for looking out for ourselves, versus the Chinese or Indians that have huge populations that might be more conducive to such strategies than smaller populations.
right. And this is kind of why I do take an approach with these, I guess you could say, issues, because I don't look at people advocating for their self-interest to be morally wrong. So Jews doing what they can to survive and thrive and grow, I don't look at that as morally wrong.
Yeah. So generally, have you had anyone run for federal office?
Well, we've had one of our guys run for state office, and then various county level positions as
So
well.
state office might not be big enough that the Israel lobby would reach out to you, but I mean, presumably the method of APAC or such organizations, if you ran for federal office, they would ask you to sign their pledge. And if you refuse to sign their pledge, they would probably support your primary opponent. Presumably they could find one of the primary participants. I mean, they would prefer all of them to sign the pledge, but should someone not be willing to sign a pro-Israel pledge, then they would actively support your opponent on a federal level. And that's basically a given anywhere in the United States that if you run for one of the 435 seats in Congress, the Israel lobby will reach out to you. And if you don't, you basically avow yourself to Israel's foreign policy, they'll support one of your opponents that does. And that's not unique to Israel. That's unique. That's basically how any lobby group would do it. You can question why the Jewish lobby might be more efficient or more well funded or powerful. But it's like Grover Norquist or something like that. You run for Congress, he's going to find you. He's going to ask you to sign his no new taxes pledge, and if you refuse to do it, he'll support your opponent.
Yeah, that is most definitely a accurate portrayal of the tactics currently being implemented. I agree with that wholeheartedly. My experience, I haven't rubbed shoulders with all 50 states, but I've rubbed shoulders with quite a few staffers, like kind of permanent government employees from multiple dozens worth of states. I'd have to like sit down and add it up. But my understanding is that the various Israeli lobbies and Jewish lobbies have a presence in all 50 state legislators. Like it is my understanding that nearly every political office is monitored at the very least, and not just by Jewish groups. Like you said, Grover Norquist.
NRA by everybody, any legitimate national political lobby that is dependent on congressional acts for their continued success. That's how business is done. You have to be on top of that, and you have to, if you're extremely large, you have to get to the candidates before the primary event. You can't wait till they get into office. You have to. You want all the primary candidates on your side. And in Michigan, that's the case. That's with gambling, that's with alcohol, that's with oil, coal, like you name it. That's how lobbying works.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about this, Dooovid, is from what I've seen, not as much time and energy is put into the lower level elected offices. Like, and in many areas around the country, I'm sure you've seen this on your ballots if you look at them, but there are quite a few positions where people run unopposed, like judges, for example. I think it's like one of the few elected positions where like more judges run opposed than run with opponents.
Yeah,
And
and you've
even
mentioned that's one of your strategies is finding elections that are unopposed and then recruiting people to basically run and fill those positions.
yeah, unopposed or even unoccupied. You would be surprised how many elected positions there's just no one running for them. And if no one's running for that position, it's not going to show up on your ballot.
Yeah, I mean, Michigan, we had the emergency fiscal managers, which I don't know if you saw the Governor Snyder, the Republican, who you made a law that the state government could basically take over local governments because they were going bankrupt and then refinance and redirect their things or even combine municipalities or whatever they had to do to get them on budget. And it was very controversial. People said they were taking away people's constitutional right by taking away their elected officials. But yeah, a lot of times those are even paid positions, and nobody runs. And depending on your area, the original dividing of the governments may have been poorly drawn, or for whatever reason, people just aren't active and no one has an interest in filling those positions. But yeah, that's probably one of the best grassroots ways to get power.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember Ron Paul. I mean, so when I was involved with Ron Paul in 2008, they were doing that. Like they had a list that then I was in New York and Long Island, and they had a list of vacant offices in or elections that no one was running for in Long Island that they were recruiting people to try to fill.
Yeah, it's a very effective strategy, and it has numerous consequences to it that play out over time. For example, like the wave of like the Tea Party movement that swept through Congress, I believe, in Obama's first midterm, and the hysterical reaction to that by the very same personalities and media organizations that are reacting in a very similar way to Trump. And I think it's a very interesting dividing line that I've seen on the right. Not so much, it's like I think there's more room to negotiate a way forward with quote unquote your side of the aisle than there is with the neoconservative, civic nationalist, evangelical alliance on the right.
Yeah, because I have a constant supply of immigrants that teaching them about America and to avow themselves to the process, as where you might be dealing with people who've been in America for tens, hundreds of years and don't really participate in the process, and for you to convince them you have to just start participating in the process, even though they or their ancestors haven't done it, is more difficult than convincing a new immigrant or urban minority to get involved in the process.
Well, right. It's certainly easier to get someone who's hungry for free food and free stuff to do XYZ and then you'll get this thing than it is to convince someone who's like set, comfortable, fat, happy, lazy, etc. Absolutely.
Yeah, although I mean, relatively, the immigrants I work off of are upper middle class, highly educated, and I do support immigration in general, but most of the immigration I directly support are university educated people.
Oh, well, that yeah, you must have access to the specialized minority of said immigrants then.
Um, well, I mean, it's on my YouTube page, but yeah, I hang out at the local. I'm an educated person. I'm involved in charities but yeah, I'm an educated person. I hang out at universities and intellectual events, engineering conferences, type things. So I am more likely. I mean, I know Mexicans that are in Detroit's also very far north. So although there are some Mexicans here, generally not. Most of the immigrants we get here are merit-based immigrants, and especially Detroit because it's not known to be the most exciting place that we.
Well, depends on how you define exciting. I think the
Well,
crime rate alone makes it fairly exciting.
well, Michigan itself has a population decline. Detroit has a population decline. So we have very good medical systems and a lot of engineering here. So on terms of getting engineers and doctors from all over the world, there's a lot of doctors and engineers, computer programmers coming to Michigan. There's not so many manufacturing jobs. I mean, there's not really too much of a reason, except for the high level positions, for anyone to come to Detroit. I mean, they'd probably be more likely even to go to your area.
Well, yeah, I mean, really what we're talking about here is white flight, Detroit is one of the most stark examples of white flight in modern times, and I think it's a very foreshadowing model for what's occurring in all of the democratic held major cities in the United States. I don't see their white population increasing and them becoming glorious examples of Western civilization. I see these cities slowly turning into shitholes. Pardon the French.
Well, the city itself, and it's interesting. I mean, because even Wayne County that houses Detroit is still majority white. It's over 50% white and like 40% African American, even though Detroit, the city itself, is like 90% African American. And Metro Detroit is still doing relatively well. Manufacturing is big. Most of the car companies still are headquartered here and have facilities in the metro area. A lot of automotive engineering still centers here in Detroit. So there are a lot of high-tech jobs. There's still many car factories and new technology, and but they don't have the old type jobs from decades ago that had people with very little education that could have relatively good union or even non-union factory jobs. And if you're going to open up non-union or cheap labor, it's unlikely they're going to do it in Detroit. But there is demand for high-level jobs. There's constantly factories being opened, IT, financial stuff. So although Detroit itself economically has a center, but actually, the Metro Detroit area is still relatively quite wealthy and center of business.
Yeah, I mean, it's an example of what civic nationalism will give to the rest of America.
We'll get into this more, but it's also that the whites in the area are somewhat unqualified for the jobs that are needed. That's why people are being imported from China and India, and also a labor type thing we might talk about where, God forbid, people from India, China, the Middle East get paid on average about $15,000 less for the same job that an American would. So there's a fiscal advantage to being able to pay a PhD, master's degree engineer $45,000 a year for a job that an American would charge $60,000 a year for, and place like India that really could be pumping out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of decent computer programmers and things like coding, and there's actually a big lack. So from my understanding, it's not a competition type thing. We need those immigrants here. Almost everybody in big business is on the side of bringing these people to the area.
Why do they need to come to my backyard to learn how to code on the internet?
We're not coming to your backyard. I'm saying they're coming to Detroit.
America, however, America is a nation of my people, and my people are being displaced, replaced, exterminated, essentially. Look at the population decline. It's getting out of control, man. Our birth rates are below replacement levels.
Well, we talk about that more, but I showed you the map of demographically. Michigan is well over 70% white. Most places in Michigan are 95% white. And however, the economic centers, there's a few places like Grand Rapids in Michigan is largely white, although even they're recruiting immigrants to fill these jobs. That when you talk about robotics, IT, different fields, is saying, I assume that these places would be hiring local people. I mean, most of the experts say that we have the job figures and we have these lists of jobs that can't be filled because people don't have the skills. So, I mean, you could argue as a policy measure that there should be some method to give the skills to the local people. But the fact is that the corporations are the ones telling us that we need these positions filled. And because no one could fulfill these positions, the corporations are the one who are sponsoring the visas and bringing the people here to the area.
Well,
I don't know if you have corporations in your area that are doing, but saying like, it's not so to say the Jews, it's Ford, it's General Motors, it's Chrysler, it's you name it. And it's saying it's the manufacturers, it's the corporations that need the demand for the, if you want to call it high skilled labor. It's the corporations that are lobbying on behalf of having these visas increased. It's the corporations that sponsor these visas, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and these corporations are not acting on the interests of the American people. They're acting upon their own interests. And I would argue that these corporations were designed to enact interests of foreigners while wrapped in the American flag. I mean, people today still think like Toyota is an American company. things like that. And this goes back a long, long time. I mean, you know, swapping flags is goes back to the days of piracy, you know.
We connect it to liberty, but the concept is I want the best man for the job. And if the local population is not the best man for the job, it's in the best interest of America to bring the best people for the job here.
Well, let me go back in time with you a little bit, because it touches on something that we were discussing earlier, and that is like the Asian population in the United States. And I'm curious if you're familiar with how many Chinese slaves were brought here and died building our railroads, and what happened to them after they were done. Like, I would argue it was not good for them. I would argue that it was better for their masters. And in turn, it damaged us as a nation, because instead of employing the native population and paying them something that they would agree to, they instead undercut that in the name of greed and brought in a foreign population and abused them. I mean, the tales are horrific, Dooovid. I don't know if you're familiar with the scale of the human trafficking that occurred during that period.
Well, say I'm mostly involved in high skill immigration. Although I'm familiar with those issues, I follow the issues. Most of the immigrants I deal with have at least a university education, and most of them have master's degrees or PhDs.
Well, see, here's the thing, man. As an American, as a patriot, I would prefer that one of my citizens was able to pursue a career in engineering, high skill stuff, whatever, even if it meant the state would help him. I would prefer that. I would invest more time and energy, more tax dollars into my own citizen than I would a foreigner. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you might be talking about things that are not feasible. And we could talk about the nature of empire. And my postulation that I would argue historically is that all empires were multicultural. And when you look in the past, from Egypt, Greece, Rome, Spain, Britain, that they only rose to empire status by following a multicultural status. And when you're concerned with the future of America, the question is, do you want, to make the country great again, or do you just want to preserve your way of life? So you mentioned like the Amish or something like that. You're saying you just want your way of life preserved, or you want to make America great again. Then you have to factually say that you're going to do what it takes to make America great again, even if it means demographically replacing the population. And certainly, like in universities, they make a lot of money off of foreign students, because like in Michigan, it only costs like $10,000-$15,000 a year for a Michigan resident, as where it costs about $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year for foreign students to study here. So they make a significant amount of money, and it allows for the universities to be better by bringing in these foreign students, not only foreign students that might be more intelligent and better able to handle the subject matter, but also foreign students that are paying a substantially higher price tag for the exact same thing than the local residents.
Okay, Dooovid. So my understanding is that what you're saying is that in order to make America great again, we need to replace the white native population.
Well, I mean, completely replaced, but I mean, saying if you look at, let's say Ford Motor Company, they're an international company, but I think their headquarters is still here in Metro Detroit, and Ford Motor Company is looking at it. They need to stay internationally competitive, and it's good for the U.S. to have these internationally competitive companies here in Michigan. So we could just close up shop and say the Japanese people are significantly better at making cars than us, so let's just stop making cars and buy them from the Japanese. Or we could make some sort of trade type thing that prevents people from buying Japanese cars, whether they're cheaper, better or not, and forcing us to buy the cars here. So from that perspective, yeah, to make America great requires us to do this. And that's why we're having the conversation. And there's multiple levels of it, but to preserve the Union and to look out for the rights of the citizens who've been in this country for hundreds of years. However, to keep America competitive, or to have the conversation collectively as a nation to how much do we want to make America great again? And saying when you have Indians and Chinese people running the companies, at some point, was that worth the price of keeping America great?
So, Dooovid, this is why I think the non-aggression principle and talking about this with you is particularly relevant and important, because I need you to understand something. By advocating for the replacement of my people, you are advocating for the decline of my people. And how could that be considered anything other than the initiation of force and act of aggression against my people?
We could argue this point, and if we accept that what I'm doing is actually harming your people, certainly it's not a direct harm. Saying it's an indirect consequence of what I'm trying to do. It's not the intention of what I'm trying to do. It's an indirect consequence of what I'm trying to do.
So indirect harm does not violate the non-aggression principle.
Well, it may or may not, but I'm wanting you to make the initial concession that at least from my intention, I mean, you might be able to claim that there's other groups that are largely Jewish, like the ADL Highest or something like that, that their intentions are probably much further than my intentions. But certainly my intentions, I have no intention to harm you or your people. My desire is to make America a better society and to
Us.
Was that again?
But like your argument is that replacing whites with non-whites will make America great again? Like that, dude.
Well, I say that's why I'm not personally involved in replacing whites. And saying that you generally we're talking about jobs, at least here in this area, that whites are unqualified to fill. And you could say if the system were set up in a different way, that maybe there's systematic structures of the educational system that make it difficult for whites to gather the skills to fill these jobs. But currently that's not the case, and there's a educational knowledge achievement gap where whites can't fulfill these jobs. In order to keep the economy functioning, to keep these corporations the best in the world, we have no choice but to bring over high skilled immigrants.
Dooovid, first, I need to look at this with you, because my question to you has to do with the initiation of force, and all I would say is, what if I were to tell you that in order to make Israel great again, we need to replace the Jewish population with non-Jews in order to save it, in order to make it better?
Well, I mean, to some extent, we have the same issue in Israel, and in fact, there's also a large amount of Asian students, at least for the specific thing that we're talking about now, that is generally agreed upon by Republicans. I mean, we're talking about something that me, who has Republican leanings in a place where there are no Republicans in office, that statewide, nationally, even President Trump probably agrees with my basic tenet here. I mean, you do agree that I'm not making a liberal argument here. I'm basically making the argument that President Trump's Republican advisors might be giving him. And we could talk about greater immigration also, and that we also disagree on. But first, I was making the point that is debated among Republicans. Well, civic, economic nationalists who care more about the economic well-being of the country versus people in your camp of the Republican Party.
Sure. And I hope that you understand that your form of autism is different than my form of autism, Dooovid, because I'm still stuck on whether or not you will acknowledge that intending to reduce the population numbers of a race is considered genocide. And that is most definitely an act of aggression.
Possibly, but it's like in terms of, I mean, if you want to get into the philosophical parts of it, so let's say personally, I'm a proponent of stand your ground. So if someone attacked you, I mean, that you would have the right to use deadly force to defend yourself, certainly in your house, not like in Europe, and even in the street. In my belief, I wouldn't mind if you carried a gun and God forbid someone attacked you, you use deadly force to defend yourself. So we're talking about a case of pure aggression, where you're talking about a case where it's, so to say, um, an indirect action. Let's take the case of Mexicans here. Let's say that I were openly advocating for giving amnesty to Mexicans, and I'm friends with a lot of Jews, and I have supported people that are involved in those causes. I'm friendly with them. People who are fighting ICE, fighting deportations.
Do you,
Um,
hold on,
oh,
Dooovid. Do you think that the people on the receiving end of the intentional population decline, do you think that they care if it's direct or indirect? Do you think that they
I'm
make
talking about as a right. So if there's someone who is, let's say, even illegally, you're saying you, in terms of self-defense, you only have self-defense against direct aggression. You don't have self-defense against indirect action. You have the right to take care. I mean, saying, like, if it was stand your ground, and God forbid you found out that the person who was sent to attack you was sent by a different person, and then you went to attack that person who sent them, that's much different than on the spot. Then you're saying that legally, your right to defend yourself is much less from an indirect attack versus a direct attack.
Well, I would argue differently, and here's why. If you accept the theory of the universal brotherhood of man, then and you accept the right for nations to exist, then you must look at the homogenous population of those nations as a family. Like, they're all interconnected, they're all interrelated. An attack on one of them by a foreign group is an attack on all of them. And me personally, I don't put an expiration date on injustices committed against my family. So, for instance, if say, God forbid, a group of foreigners killed someone related to you, okay, I believe you would be justified in seeking retribution, especially if they came onto your land and committed against crimes against one of your family members.
And that's certainly not the U.S. law. I mean, if you're arguing that from a point of philosophically, but that's not the case of U.S. law.
Well,
Even, God forbid, if someone killed your most loved, God forbid anybody killed a loved person of them, and they sought out extra judicial revenge
I think
against the person, they could be put in prison for the rest of their life. And a person, the U.S. citizen, you're obligated to go through the courts, through the law, the justice system. You're not allowed to take it into your own hands. If you're arguing philosophically against the tenet of the U.S. law,
what I'm saying is that the systems that we're operating under are not a reflection of the people who built the nation. That the systems we're operating under are hostile to our interests. Our own government is being used against us, and it's being used to expedite the population decline of our people.
yeah, I mean, and let's say I accept that tenet, but you're talking about action reaction, and the punishment has to fit the crime, and there is a difference between direct and indirect. So politically, when you're talking about your politics, certainly the disease is more important than the symptoms. So you're saying you're fighting the symptoms of locally, let's say, crime, and you've looked at the crime statistics, and God forbid, let's say your crime statistics show that it's a majority immigrants or people from different places that are committing the crime. So you're saying the direct action of dealing with the crime in your area is only dealing with the crime in your area. The indirect thing would be looking at it as, well, who are these people and how did they get here? And so when you're looking at it indirectly and you're like, oh, there's an organization that is filling out visas and paying for these people, and they're sending them to my neighborhood, and then they're committing crimes, that's indirect. So legally, when you deal with the direct case of crime in your neighborhood, you have a much stronger case than indirectly when you deal with the organizations that are enabling those people to get there.
I would
Even
argue.
though strategically, you might say you have to eliminate it at the cause, but it's saying
But
let's say someone like Hayes, let's say they committed no crime. Hayes did work within the system and they committed no crime. And even though they might be helping people from different countries enter and move into your neighborhood within the boundary of the system, that they have not done anything wrong, even though strategically they are negatively affecting your people. And God forbid, I've had these arguments before, and even if you could fit that in under the United Nations definition of genocide, because there are different ways to understand the definition of genocide, and even if someone accepted your definition of genocide, does that give you the right to protect yourself against the people that are trying to displace your population?
Well, that is a very good point. It's a very, I think that is something that does need to be addressed. And I think one of the problems in these conversations is the failure to understand the consequences of that quote unquote indirect behavior. And by that I mean, can you really blame the people who are suffering at the hands of this indirect action? Can you blame them for blaming those people?
I assume generally people are rational actors, and even people who commit crimes or do heinous acts and generally have a rationality. It may not be a correct rationality, that they haven't accurately assessed action, reaction, and the crime and punishment, but there are logical actors who have just inaccurately assessed the punishment and crime situation. But I mean, certainly I've thought about that here in Detroit. Generally, Detroit needs population. We talked about urban planning offline, and I'm a huge fan of urban planning. My urban planning books are actually on the other side of my room, so they're not in the background here. But
I am a huge fan as well.
Yeah, and I'm a civil engineer by training. So the infrastructure in Detroit was built for 1.5 million people, and now there's only about 800,000 people, and we have deteriorating roads here, and water problems, city services problems, largely based on the budget, that it's too difficult to upkeep the civil services for the city. In Flint, I'm sure you heard about the Flint water crisis, which is basically the same thing, declining population. It was too expensive to upkeep the infrastructure. The water went bad, and God forbid, people are suffering horribly from bad water. So from that perspective, almost everyone in Detroit agrees what we need is a few 100,000 people to move to Detroit. That's a factual evidence type thing that I could document to you from engineering infrastructure. So the question is, where are those people going to come from? And considering it's unlikely a bunch of rural whites are going to move back to Detroit, so let's say let's bring a whole bunch of immigrants here. But the fact is, once they come to Detroit, they have the right to pick up and move anywhere else in the U.S. And so even if you assume the best intentions, you say, okay, these people in Detroit are basically do-gooders. They don't mean you any harm. They really want what's best for their area. However, and that may or may not be accurate, to give them that benefit of the doubt, but let's say, for the sake of this argument, that they have no ill intentions. They only want to make Detroit better, and Detroit needs more people, so we're going to bring them from abroad. However, once they come to America, they exercise their legal right and they move into your neighborhood.
Well, I mean, Dooovid, I think there's pretty obvious reasons why people aren't interested in moving to Detroit.
Yeah, so we get high-skilled immigrants that move here, and we have to pay them a lot of money.
And even then, it's not like they're having a blast and love the city and love the culture and love the crime and love the degeneracy. It's not it's not an appealing place for a normal, healthy, well-adjusted person.
Well, I think actually a lot of the Muslims and Hindus that come here are actually relatively healthy and well-adjusted, and they come here because we'll allow them to live as a Hindu here in Detroit. They could set up their self and practice as they see fit, work at Ford and do their jobs and get their paycheck, and then open up their temples and do their thing. And Muslims basically could live according to Sharia law right here in Detroit. And so from that perspective, I look at these Hindu, Chinese, Muslims is relatively healthy, and there's reasons why they, certainly there's a risk living in Detroit. We have high crime, hundreds of murders go unsolved every year in Detroit, and there's a lot of unfortunate things here. However, from that perspective, I do think the most of the immigrants who come here are relatively good citizens, pretty stable, and have a decent trade-off. From the perspective of coming to.
Are you still with me?
Even if we let them, would be unlikely to come to Detroit. Although we do have Mexicans here, but it's in that it's unlikely that 100,000 Mexicans would want to come and move here to Detroit. And if we help them get here to Detroit, they would likely abandon Detroit and move on to greener pastures.
So do you think that Detroit is headed for a better future or with more of the same?
I mean, honestly, I think most of the people in Detroit would like to recruit white people here. However, white people there are some that come here. I mean, there are quite a few that come here, but generally, there's not a big demand. There's not large amounts of white people looking to come to Detroit. So we have a huge population of Bengalis, Bangladeshi, Yemenis, and your different people that, if you're a Muslim looking to come to America, Detroit is probably one of your better prospects. So if you're coming from Yemen or Iraq or Syria or something like that, and you're looking at the American map, where should you go? You might come to Detroit because they have very pro-Islamic set up infrastructure. You might even be able to survive in Detroit not speaking English, only speaking Arabic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's proof positive that there is a proactive agenda to replace the native white American population. I mean, I don't doubt it for a second, dude. I see it happen.
But they're not replacing whites when they come here to this area. So you're talking about the geographic representation of whites in Michigan is not affected by the people coming here to Detroit. There's still most of 90%, 70% of Michigan is still close to a 90% white.
Dooovid, blacks in Detroit are net negatives on the tax budget, on the budgets, man. They take more than they contribute. Same with
that may be, but so one thing, blacks aren't newly moving here, although we do have quite a bit of Nigerians. Like even Nigerians, if you're from Nigeria and looking for a place to come in America, Detroit might be one of your better options. But there's not a huge amount of African Americans that move out of the urban areas to more wider Michigan.
Well, part of the increase in population in urban centers of non-whites is what drove whites to leave. With it come increased crime rates and a wide variety of other issues. So I think it only makes rational sense for the overwhelming white population who built Detroit and turned it into the economic powerhouse that it once was. I think there's a fairly perfect correlation between the forced integration with foreign minorities, my dude. It's a fairly clear pattern, and we're seeing it happen right now. Like Seattle, Portland.
Factually, in Detroit, you're incorrect. You may be correct in other places, but I mean, Detroit, when Henry Ford came up with the $5 workday, that he always, Ford. I mean, so if you're blaming it on Ford policy, but Ford policy was like that for over 100 years. We brought Syrians. One of the main reasons there's so many African Americans in Detroit was they came to work in the auto industry and manufacturing. So, I mean, manufacture in Detroit was largely always multicultural. It may have been majority white, 70, 80% white, but people were always coming from all over the world. And as I said, the reason why there's so many African Americans in Detroit was for auto jobs.
Yeah, and look, man, I am of the position that quote unquote African Americans, Black Americans, I view them as part of the fabric of America. I mean, there are black genetic lines that have been here for hundreds of years. Um, I, I, I think there's plenty of room for the argument that, like, quote unquote, not all diversity is bad. Um, it's just, it's the forced participation, the forced integration, the using government to extract resources from one population and then give it to others. We're seeing this happen now, man. I mean, it's to the point where it's like negatively affecting Asians, you know, and they vote Democrat.
Well, so
Like,
certainly under the Obama administration. So when you're talking about extracting resources,
mm,
until you so to say displace the majority geographic control that whites have, I don't see how you're changing resources, because obviously the vast amount of property and land across all of America is you controlled by whites, and you might find the divide on the east and west coast, and certainly in Detroit, the the metropolitan area. But unless you're talking about sending so to say minorities all over geographic America, and in the Obama administration, we talk about like Somalis going to Minnesota. There are a lot of policies directly like that, and that we might be in more agreement. However, there are so to say leftists that have a complete disagreement about your concept of America, and that are actively trying to do what you're saying, that are actively trying to get minorities to move across America to claim land and displace whites. But I mean, when we're talking about Detroit, I don't see on the microcosm of Detroit how any of that is changing the overall demographics of America.
well, the the creation of government policy is what precipitates it. Arguably, non-government organizations proactively agitate for different avenues of replacing whites, or another way to put it, of creating disadvantageous circumstances and environments for whites, and advantageous circumstance and environments for whatever particular ethnic group they're trying to integrate into the white majority population. And by creating, it's like you give them an inch, you give them an in, and then it just opens the floodgates from there. And this is what happened with Detroit. I mean, the black population in Detroit was fairly stable for like decades. And then through the implementation of policies that put a greater tax burden on whites in order to subsidize blacks, it started attracting greater and greater numbers of the black population. They
Well, I
started
mean, really what happened is the jobs went overseas. The jobs went to Mexico, and it equally affected blacks and whites.
what I'm saying, yes, it did escalate to that point. But what I'm saying is that it never starts out with like the end result coming at the front end. You know, it's always done through incrementalism of policy, pushing things to one point to another point. It's like the endless civil rights struggle. You know, like, how's it going to end up, man? You know, I got to work 80 hours a week to support a black dude who has 9 kids with 8 women, you know, and this is what's happening right now. Like, it's to me, dude, it's like criminal. You know, our government should not function to extract resources from me and then give it to a population that wants to destroy me. Like, that's terrible, man. I don't know how else to put it. You know, put yourself in my position. And
Well, I have thought about it. I mean, so that's why we're having the conversation. And obviously, I don't face much opposition here in Detroit, although I know, like in Lansing, the capital of Michigan, we face opposition on a national scale. I know there's opposition, but like generally in my area, there's not opposition to what we're doing.
well, yeah, there's not opposition because you guys have successfully displaced the white population. You've put them under the point of parity, where you can now control them through the democratic institutions that their ancestors created to protect them. Like, it's very perverse, in my opinion. Like, why not just liquidate the entire white infrastructure that was built and then recreate it in this diversity utopia?
Well,
It
I've had
seems
these arguments when I'm saying like, I mean, you could look at it as a conspiracy, and we could talk about possible conspiracy and who's involved in actively changing the law, running these organizations. But let's look at it from the big picture of just greater forces, economic, population, migration forces. So it might be that, so to say, Jews are generally pro-multicultural, pro-immigration, but certainly there's economic principles of supply and demand, and there's pressure to drive labor down. There's pressure to drive the wages down. There's pressure to bring in higher skilled people to the country. There's pressures of population density, where people from more population dense areas are going to come to more sparse populated areas. And you could try to set government policy to control those forces, but those forces are going to be at play no matter what. There's going to be, I did a few hour thing on my channel looking at the statistics, and there's basically hundreds of millions of people across the world that desire to come to the U.S. There's I don't know what the statistic, the UN put out, like 60 million refugees right now, and surveyed 1/3 of those refugees say they want to come to the U.S. So if you look at the policy and what's the best action of policy, but you're saying those forces are not a conspiracy. Those are forces that you're going to have to deal with no matter what policy you choose.
Right. And this is why I don't take the conspiratorial, quote unquote, approach to Jews. I just look at them as one group of people that have power and influence that are advocating for their interests, just like the Chinese are. I mean, I saw recently that their behavioral social networking programs that they have, where you get like actual credit for material goods and rewards if you speak positively about the government on social media, they're using those scores to find the most pro-Chinese people, and then they're giving them incentives to move to foreign countries. And they're like coordinating where they're essentially injecting the most ethnocentric Chinese population in foreign countries. I think it's incredible. So I fully acknowledge it's not like a quote unquote grand conspiracy. It's just people trying to get as much as they can, see their kids be healthy, successful, strong, be vigilant against any aggression perpetrated against them, etc.
But earlier you claimed, saying that there's not actually an anti-white animosity or conspiracy. It's just non-whites looking out for their self-interest, other people looking to make a better life for themselves who want to come here in America. It's not something intrinsically anti-white.
Well, what I'm saying is they may use anti-white language. Like, I most definitely agree. There's a quote unquote anti-white like theme going on here.
Because whites are largely the group that want to prevent those people from, so to say, realizing their dreams. So when people want to come to America and say they can't get in here, and immigration, they have to wait for their visa and say, what's the holdup? Why can't I get up and get into America? That they say, oh, it's these white people. They don't want us there because they think they built up the country and it's their ancestors' infrastructure, and so on and so on. So from that perspective, the whites become their ideological opponents, and you could see Jews as a minority in America that might be willing to side with the outside group from the populist host, the populist people in the country.
Yeah. I mean, there's very clear evidence of different Jewish interest groups agitating non-white groups to essentially embrace more anti-white rhetoric and start doing the whole, you're familiar with like the liberal blaming straight white heterosexual men for everything kind of narrative. I mean
that's
it's not a conspiracy.
Yeah, I disapprove of the harsh rhetoric on any side, or racist rhetoric. But yeah, say that the goal is to change policy and win elections, and people use fear mongering tactics on both sides. The people on the right, they say they're going to open the borders and God forbid flood you with dark hordes of people, and the people on the left say that
God forbid.
But the people on the left are warning that you have to worry about the whites. You have to, vote Democrat. You have to run for office because the whites are going to kick you out of the country.
Oh yeah, that fear mongering, absolutely. Yeah, that gets amped up all the time.
Well, on both sides.
Well, not necessarily on both sides, because there is currently none of the media, none of the print outlets, no mainstream elected official is taking pro-white positions without serious damage being inflicted upon them, both directly and indirectly.
Well, because they're largely controlled by corporations, and the corporations have advantage from displacing the native population because it drives down the price of labor and it helps bring in high-skilled talent.
The very same corporations who write the legislation that our government uses force to enact. Absolutely. I agree with that.
I mean, it's like Bernie Sanders, who tries to deflect every time you mention George Soros. He mentions the Koch brothers.
Yeah, sure. But I would argue, like,
there's but if it was Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or anybody, the corporate interest of the person is likely to be pro-immigration.
Yeah,
and that's one reason why you saw like Hillary Clinton, that the corporate interests largely backed Hillary Clinton.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, we see that all over the world too. That's not just isolated to America, But see, the thing that I really wanted to like get your opinion on was going back to this concept of non-aggression, because if you're willing to acknowledge that indirect or direct attempts to reduce your population numbers is an act of aggression, then I don't understand how if you say you support the concepts of non-aggression, how you could support any direct or indirect action that would result in the decline of my people. Because I don't support that for yours.
Well, because there's multiple factors at play, and to be to truly apply non-aggression might be near impossible, because all actions have a reaction, and so it's basically impossible to act in the world as a significant player without negatively affecting some people, even if it's not intended or the person feels greatly sorry for doing it. Just like you're saying the same thing could apply upon you, like non-aggression, that you're actively preventing these people from coming to your country. That certainly the left has a right to attack you, demonize you, try to deplatform you, and even ruin your life, because you're ruining other people's life by not allowing them to come to this country.
They're not entitled to come into my country.
Well, it might be legal, but it's saying from a perspective of a different person, saying it's God's world, it's not your world. Countries and borders are artificial. God created the world, and the God I believe in said that I could live anywhere I want.
Yeah, that's not that's not the reality that most heterosexual masculine white men live in, my dude.
It probably is. I mean, historically, that certainly was, Europeans' attitude when they came to America, and so to say, colonize the land, that they thought they had a God-given right to do it. And in the same way that Europeans colonized the land, why can't another nation colonize you?
Well, see, this is what's interesting about this. If you are willing to acknowledge that what is happening is a proactive colonization and population reduction of my people, essentially, Dooovid, those are words of war. Those are words.
So one thing you're inaccurate, that from anything I've seen, there's not a population reduction of whites. There might be a great increase in population of non-whites, as where whites are basically being stabilized. Although I've not seen any evidence that white populations are decreasing.
How can our population go up if our birth rates are declining and are already below parity?
Well, I'm saying there's hundreds of millions of white people. From the statistics I've seen, the population of whites is basically increasing in most places. It's just the population of non-whites is increasing at a faster pace. So if you're actively saying that your population is decreasing. That's my understanding, is it's factually incorrect. The population of whites is still increasing.
Dooovid, do you want to see Japan go from being 98.6% Japanese to down to 70 and then make that same argument? Do you really think they would even consider that? Like, they would laugh in your face, dude. That's not, that is quite literally the definition of not an argument. You're telling these people, we are going to displace you in your own nation.
But I'm just making, are you purposely using inaccurate language when you say that you admit that that's not the case, that the white population is only going down as percentage of the whole population due to other populations increasing faster, and that there's no sign at all of some active, God forbid, like genocide or a decrease in the white population?
What I have seen, Dooovid, is our birth rates go down and have gone below 2, which means we will no longer be adding to our net population. It will only be subtracting as time goes on. What I have also seen is non-whites being injected into these white nations, and that this process of birth rates being reduced and non-whites being introduced into the population, I cannot see that as anything other than a replacement strategy. And not
I understand your perspective. I'm just making the point that the same non-aggression principle that you're applying, that you feel is being violated against you, that the opposite side of the aisle feels the same way against you, that you are inaccurately claiming that you own more than you honestly have a right to claim. I mean, like the sparse population density, that maybe your ancestors at a time when humanity had less people were able to claim large swaths of land for a tiny population, but now it's coming into question your right to that property and land. And other people are coming to there like, you can't claim all this property and these resources. There's too many people on the planet. And by you, as so to say, whites or a nation trying to control such a vast territory as the U.S., that you're trying to prevent immigrants from coming in here, that you're harming them, and the exact same argument that you're giving about non-aggression could equally harm
anyone by not allowing them on my private property. All I see a nation is a collection of private property, and then as that private property expands, there is more space in between other places of private property, and those spaces get claimed. It's a very natural progress. I mean, we didn't
get into the nature of what's the nature of property right. Where does your right to own property comes from? Is there a generational right to own property? Do other people have a claim on your land and the resources it contains? So if you come from a sparse area where a handful of whites that came there hundreds of years ago could dominate tens and tens, hundreds of square miles, and say, this property is mine, my ancestors claimed it. But now with population increases and a resource shortage, and saying we need those resources, you're taking more than your fair share. And we're going to forcefully take from you what the overshare that you're keeping for yourself.
Dooovid, I mean,
and even say forcefully, but it's saying the non-aggression, when you claim these resources as yourself and other people are strapped for resources and they're suffering due to lack of resources, that they're going to have to come, I mean, as a matter of survival or whatever you look at, but the same non-aggression principle is exactly in play on the other side, that they're coming for your resources, that your claim to might be less strong than you think.
Well, this is why I am not a supporter of the non-aggression principle, and why I think that civic nationalism and this modern form of quote unquote democracy that we live under, it's not, obviously not sustainable, but it's also not acting in harmony with the values of the founding stock of the people of this nation. And I mean, I really don't, like, you seriously don't really question the validity of nations, of nation states, of how those become countries. I mean, surely you don't question that.
Well, I don't quite, but I say there's a question on whether nation means a civic nationalism, where nation means the people who were born in the territory, or there's some sort of ethnic component to the peoplehood. I would argue on that. I'm definitely more a civic nationalist. I mean, certainly here in the U.S. and even being a Jew, I feel pretty comfortable here in the U.S. Although both my grandparents served here World War II, and I've been here for generations. That we've had property. I mean, I feel very comfortable here in the U.S. Even my Jewish ancestors felt very comfortable here in the U.S. But looking at the founding of a nation to claim a vast amount of territory, whether you want to get into the Native Americans, and obviously there's peace treaties and reservations all over the place, but not even getting into that a sparse amount of people claimed a huge amount of territory. And you legitimately claim that territory where now you could close off the border and say it's ours from now till forever is really a questionable thing.
I don't think anybody questioned the legitimacy of like Thomas Jefferson's property or Robert E. Lee's or George Washington's or Hamilton. I don't think anybody questioned their legitimacy. You see, these questions come into play when foreigners come into white, Aryan, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, etc. nations and start wanting their way of doing things to be done by the host population. And I would argue that one of the reasons why you feel comfortable is because your people enacted their ethnocentric interests by staking a claim in my nation and then creating environments based on your essentially biological behavior, like your tendencies. So
if you want to argue just the Jewish involvement, I mean, certainly
well,
I would argue the question of whether America was, it's saying you're in the diaspora. If you're European, you're not in your native land, you're in the diaspora. And to some extent, America was basically a corporation from the beginning. And it was actually Jews who helped found that corporation. The Dutch East India Stock Company was largely created by Jews. And, so to say, when your ancestors came here to America, it was probably impossible without the help of Jewish bankers. It wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I would also argue that
1620. I mean, that's the Dutch coming before the British and the war that was fought. I mean, but the Dutch setting. There are a bunch of people coming to New York, but almost all of the people from Europe, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, all had Jewish bankers.
Yeah, there were quite a few. I don't disagree with that. I would just make the argument that at the time, those Jewish bankers, they understood that the Anglo-Saxons were like the concept of blood and soil to them, they didn't question. Like they fundamentally understood those who helped build the founding of America, those who helped support our revolution against the British. Any of those factions understood that we were claiming this territory as ours. No matter how much money we owed them, it wasn't going to be theirs. It's ours. And then they're investing in us.
There's a difference between blood and soil where your population comes from versus, okay, you may have been here for 13 generations or however long your family has been here, but you came from someplace else.
Yeah, this
is not a native European land. There were no, as far as we know, there were no white people in America previous to 500 years ago.
Right. However,
we know there are white people in Europe going back, if you believe in evolution, tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this fits in line with that line of reasoning, because if you look at how America was formed, it is very much in line with the history of various white populations' behavioral patterns. Like the way other nations came about in white subspecies, they're all distinct from one another, but there's very similar behavioral patterns, characteristics in place. I mean, it's like the same tale told with different aesthetics nearly every time.
You can give a geographical latitude possible argument, but what place are there that Europeans went and settled that Europeans are still in control of besides the U.S.? It may be Australia, but almost all the places where Europeans settled have reverted back to non-European control.
Well, that is a good point. Although I would make the argument that many parts of North Africa were settled, colonized by the European stock. and that those populations were all but wiped out. And
But just like South Africa, I'm saying, with your same argument, would that apply to South Africa? Would that apply to South America? Would that apply to North Africa? And you're saying that all's fair in love and war, and that's what happened. But how is America an exception? Or you'd be making the exact same argument for any of the places that Europeans went to.
This is why I do not adopt the hardline non-aggression principle, because you just talking to me about this now, you make claims about what is or isn't an act of aggression. You try to parse, essentially, to divide out and
deconstruct the.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I don't have a problem with that. It's just what I'm trying to communicate to you is that if I were to make a direct or indirect threat to you, or to your brother, or to your mother, or to your neighborhood, or to your city, right? Whether or not it's direct or indirect doesn't change the fact that it's a threat. And I don't think it's okay if a white person makes the same equivalent threat towards any other group of population. I certainly can't. And here's the thing, I don't want that. I don't want to reduce population numbers of anyone on this planet. And that's why I think your idea about it, like in my head, I thought of it like multi-fractal ethno-states, like little tiny like ethno-states or culture states. Like, this is the gay city, this is a black Muslim city, this is a black Afrocentric city, etc.
Well, I lived in New York for over 10 years, and so it's somewhat already like that. And as I said, even here in Detroit is like that to some areas where you could go to Dearborn and you might be likely to hear Arabic on the street, or certainly New York City, where I think a minority of people there speak English as a first language. And so I've lived that reality. So you're just trying to put that on a more regional scale, what's already happening in the major urban areas.
Yeah, and I personally don't have a problem with using government to incentivize the movement of people. Like, it has a very long history of well executed operations when it comes to like dealing with like towns being destroyed and having an incoming population, and then the various other towns would pitch in and help out with their neighbors. But very rarely do we see this work and last and lead to anything other but violence and chaos when it involves a foreign group of people. And so I think there is a very strong argument to be made where, Dooovid, if you are willing to not initiate force against white people, what we are going to do is we are going to group together, and we are not going to give anyone in the outgroup anything for free. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, people are going to do what they have to do to survive, and whether it's so or not. But I mean, if we put back this argument upon you, that's why white control of Europe is destined to fail, because your population isn't naturally from here. And even though you may have been here for 13 generations, because to some extent you're not natural or indigenous to this land, you also will be replaced. And in looking at the long history, if you accurately look at the role that Jews played in helping Europeans come to America, that we're still playing the same role. That the same way we helped you guys get here, now we're helping other people get here.
Right. Yeah. Oh, definitely. So something comes to mind, and it's a question I have for you. Do you see it as a possibility for the United States to remain the United States of America? Or do you think this like end of America theory, which, I'd just love to hear your thoughts more about that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm more chess player, independent scholar, analyzing scenarios. So this concept that I've had of the fractal mini ethno-states divided over America, that based on maybe free market or different constitutional things like First Amendment, Second Amendment, those things could preserve America. But my analysis is otherwise balkanization, and saying just like you're ready to fight and go to war and defend your civilization, Donald Trump lost the majority of the war. Saying that there's in Detroit, we encourage African Americans to be gun owners. There's probably over 500,000 Detroit African Americans in this area that own weapons, and let alone Hispanics or whatever. So I mean, if it did come to war, a civil war like that, it'd be a catastrophe. And I don't see either side winning. I don't think we might be able to come together and limit it, limit immigration or slow the ethnic demographic change of America, or you might be able to try to come up with a way to change the welfare system, benefit systems that will help whites have more children. But in terms of the both sides are already too strong that I don't see whites, so to say, taking back the country at this point. I don't think it's feasible, and I don't see if you see it as feasible.
I don't. That's personally not on my to-do list. I'm more concerned with my state, my local community. For instance, I've completely written off California. Same with Michigan, Texas. I think that if you're white and you live in Texas, you need to move it to the Midwest at the very least, or the Inland Empire up where I'm at. I don't think it's safe for white people to be living in Los Angeles, for example.
I'm saying presumably a good fraction or majority of the white people are going to prefer to live in a multicultural world and aren't going to be so worried that they need to live only amongst their homes. And that's kind of what I'm saying, is that in the one major problem that you're going to face is that the corporations and economic and university system is likely to stay on the multicultural side. So even if you are successful, you're going to have the problem economically that you're going to have a hard time competing with the corporations that are almost certainly going to go multicultural. And you're going to have a hard time educating yourself and being qualified to lead your people into the 21st century without training at the top universities that are basically all pro-multicultural.
That's interesting, Dooovid, because I think if you're willing to acknowledge that there is potential for the American Union to suffer, fracture, etc., then I think that comes with a recognition that the systems that we have are currently unsustainable. And if something's unsustainable, that means it's going to come to an end. And what I'm saying is that a greater and greater percentage of the white population is becoming aware of their demographic replacement, and the more people who suffer at the hands of diversity, who decide to leave or witness someone else and just can't take it anymore, white flight is increasing. It's not decreasing, Dooovid. All of these major liberal cities are not experiencing an increase in the white population, and their birth rates are certainly lower than the rural populations. So what's happening is these policies that have been enacted, what they're doing is they're driving white people out of metropolises, industrial powerhouses, and there's a brain drain that's experienced by those cities, as well as they lose tax revenue from it as well. And it can be quite devastating, as quite a few cities in Michigan and Illinois are great examples of this. Illinois is I think it's in worse trouble than Michigan, so
I am a balanced budget conservative. I mean, generally, to me, the national deficit is a huge problem, and so to say, the welfare state is unsustainable, and so that we are in agreement. I mean, the multiple factors that are bringing the decline of America and the onset, besides for the demographic, racial challenges, presumably the federal deficit is the biggest problem facing us.
Well, I would tend to agree with that. In addition to the decline of the white population, I mean, like once Texas goes blue, there's never going to be another Republican elected again.
I see from your perspective, obviously from your perspective, that's an issue, but from the State of the Union for the prosperity of America, I don't see why the demographics of the country make a difference. I mean, like Ben Shapiro said, I don't care if America goes majority brown, and certainly for the whites who maybe have a way of life they're used to, that might be an issue. But I don't. What argument are you making besides for your own personal interest that that's going to be bad for America?
Well, honestly, I think what would be better for non-whites in America as well as in Mexico, I think we have a vested interest in a healthy and successful future for Mexico and the Mexican people. And what I see happening, Dooovid, is that as the white population concentrates away from the non-white population in the United States, we're going to start seeing economic improvement in those states. And there will be a distinct separation between who is actually generating tax revenue and who is draining from tax revenue. And if it gets to the point where a state like South Carolina is demanding money from all the other states, well, what if my state says no? And that's where I see the fracture coming. Like, we're putting in, we're not getting anything back. You're not reciprocating. This is negatively affecting the future of our children. You're proactively targeting policies that include only us and exclude you. It's like there's two tiers of system of law now, man. There's one if you're white, and then there's one if you fit the diversity quota. It's getting absurd. And more white people have suffered at the hands of this hypocritical system. And there will be a breaking point, my dude. That's why I think in conversations like this are very important. Because oh my goodness, dude. Have you tried to talk about any of these sort of topics with people on the left? It's getting absurd.
Well, I mean, saying the reality is the only people like you I talk with are over YouTube, because in my area, we're on the opposite side of the divide, and most people are complaining about the disproportionate wealth in America, controlled by whites, or say African Americans are looking at their, God forbid, average net worth might be, if it's like 9 or 11 times smaller in America than your average white. So actually, I've never once here in Detroit heard someone articulate your position, although I've read it. I'm certain that maybe even the majority of white America agrees with you. However, in my area, the concerns are more pushing on the opposite side.
Sure, I find it
even from even from, so to say, whites in Detroit, because I mean, as I mentioned, even the county that contains Detroit is still majority white.
Sure.
You might see some resentment in universities, but yeah, I mean, if it's the system, so if you're saying that it's the whites, I mean, if you might say that the whites aren't voluntarily compliant and they just live according to this because that's what they have to do to get ahead or not face repercussions in the governmental system, or because generally that whites disagree with you. Well, and I can't speak for them, but certainly in my area, it's very rarely to hear someone publicly voice your opinion.
Here's where
anyone who studies politics or President Trump, and certainly like ADL in Jewish groups, constantly play people who say far worse than what you're saying as the tactic of why we have to beat you at the ballot box.
Right. Part of the problem is, like, as you were saying earlier, like the power isn't always at the ballot box. So I think what a lot of those guys are doing is seeking forms of power that go counter to what the system provides. In fact,
you agree with President Trump trying to crack down on Ford?
Oh, well, you see, Ford has been bailed out so many times. Like, Ford shouldn't even exist. I I want Ford to get nothing. I want zero. I want zero tax dollars to go to Ford. I want them to pay all their debts.
You support punitive actions that President Trump has been warning about for closing factories or moving factories.
Yeah, I think every corporation that money from the federal government needs to be audited like immediately. This has gone way too far, you know.
Yeah, I mean, me and you are in full agreement. I mean, we both have libertarian backgrounds. I never supported corporate welfare or the mixing of the corporations into the government that exists today. And yeah, but as an independent scholar, just looking at the nature of what does it mean to make America great again, are you talking about being internationally competitive and having the best corporations, or are you willing to let that decline to have some sort of greater stability here in the country? And you mentioned like Europe, we were talking offline earlier, where presumably the most economic powerhouses in Europe have the same strategy of the U.S., namely Britain, Germany, and France, that are relatively still the most economically powerful in Europe, have made the same decision that the U.S. is making, that in order to maintain economic power, they need to increase immigration, increase diversity.
Right. In order to be better, they must destroy the nation. I mean, it's quite silly to me, you know. This is why I think nationalism is something that's like totally normal, man. You know, if you're opposed to your nation being destroyed by foreigners and these weird international bankers and their like systems that they impose on you, I just think that's silly. It's ridiculous at face value. And most people, you know, I think you mentioned this, they just try and get by, you know. It's like why dedicate your time and energy to going against this huge, massively complex, highly bureaucratic system? It's almost as if it was designed to dissuade a majority of the population from participating. not that that's the case. It's just that's what it, you know, that's how it looks like from the outside. And something I wanted to just mention to you really quickly is the Democratic and the Republican Party, Dooovid, they negotiate with one another about how to, you know, like redistrict districts, how to structure the party, legal precedent, all that stuff. And one of the interesting things about it is in your precinct, you'll have a seat for the Democrats and a seat for the Republicans. And something that I've noticed in these highly diverse cities that are heavily Democratic, there is a higher percentage of the Republican seats that are unoccupied. So if you want to run as a Republican in your precinct, there's a good chance that no one's even taken the position.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to put a more philosophical switch on the direction, because you have your theories of government, and generally the concept of liberalism, of individual rights, is going to push towards globalism. That if your different governmental theories, largely after World War II, this concept of liberalism, equal rights for everybody, has largely won out. Communism is less powerful. Fascism has largely been universally denounced, so it might be rising. And liberalism became the main paradigm. And the nature of liberalism is to try to create a one world order. And like President Bush Sr., who openly called for a one world order, and the Council of Foreign Relations. And it's only been in the last 10 years, really, since the global financial collapse of 2007, 2008, that there's been a pushback against globalism. But so in my perspective, just these greater forces are pushing us towards globalism, and globalism will have its difficulties but provide more answers. And that's why I'm trying to preserve the protection of people's rights within the global society, where you seem to be pushing back actively against globalism.
Yeah, definitely. I believe in the autonomy of the nation state. And I think that nation states, like, it's fine if, you know, Germany and France as two separate nation states want to make an alliance and like share power between them. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is people volunteering me for wars that I do not want to fight in, or my children, or my grandfather, even. You know, I have pretty strong resentments about wars fought by my forefathers for interests that have only harmed us.
But couldn't someone argue that's what you're doing? You're volunteering whites to fight a war they don't want to fight. Most whites are happy. Um,
Hey,
if they're not happy, they're willing to be demographically displaced to become a minority in, so to say, their own country, and you're voluntarily trying to sign them up for a war they're not interested in.
Dooovid, unless you are willing to initiate force against us, I don't see any potential for war. What I see is people advocating for being able to peacefully pursue their interests without having to make sacrifices, or especially sacrifices on their children or grandchildren's behalf in order to benefit a foreign outgroup. I think that's morally reprehensible.
Well, I'm looking like in terms of people that maybe like Mike Bloomberg or Paul Krugman that might argue that really what the U.S. needs to do is increase immigration in order to preserve the union and keep America great. We should aim to try to have like 500 million people. If right now we're absorbing about 1 million immigrants per year, we should increase that to 2 million immigrants per year, and something like that, where you're saying that's indirectly aggression against you. That our vision for the greater America is to increase the population and is to keep on bringing in more people. That you're saying you want to sign, so to say, the larger white community. If that's the case, that you guys should, I don't know, war or whatever you're going to do to try to stop it within your power to try to stop these greater forces that are trying to do that.
Well, see, Dooovid, this is why I think being able to have these conversations is so important, because I think that we will be able to avert another World War I, World War II type situation. I believe we'll be able to avert another civil war. I believe we'll be able to avert quite a bit amount of violence. And I think we can do that through negotiation. And I think that our side of things is willing to make sacrifices in those negotiations if it results in a net peace and stability, just as I think any racial in-group would.
I mean, you're like me, you're assuming that basically people are rational actors, although they might not be experts in logic and have poor decisions. They might inaccurately estimate, but people are basically rational, are going to do what's best for themselves. And through having these conversations, instead of straw manning the other side, actually talking to the other side, we could see what the interests are and path the chart forward that benefits everybody to the best of the ability, and to have continual negotiations on these matters, and there's strategy, like President Trump as strategy when he's like, I don't like people knowing what I know. Like there's certain negotiation strategy, but at the same time, there might be a better kind of like global, just let's lay our cards down and try to work something out.
I would like to see that happen. Like, because man, I don't want the elderly to suffer. I don't want there to be economic collapses or large scale conflicts, dude. Like that sounds absolutely terrible. And this is something that I kind of dislike a little bit about some of the more dissident right-wing behavior, is because they are reacting to the replacement of their people. There's like a emotional component to it that, I kind of got through earlier in life. So being able to take in new information and not let like emotion kind of cloud your your perception of the world, I think that's important. So I do attribute the, you know, the quote unquote rational actor kind of as a default with people until they demonstrate otherwise, I would say. But I don't innately assume that people are just malicious or intending violence or anything of that nature. I go entirely based on, you know, what I see, what I hear, what I smell, etc.
But we take, I mean, immigration to most people on, so to say, dissident alt-right is the number one key issue. And you might looking at it was like a return to state right, is, you know, essentially a libertarian small government person, that somehow you could return states' rights. Because, you know, let's look California, Florida, New York. The blue states are trying to pump up the volume on immigration and just, you know, saying we got to start bringing more people here. And the demographic change, at least electorally, temporarily benefits the blue cause, because, you know, generally, I mean, people used to joke, you know, like whatever case, like, but I mean, new immigrants are generally going to be Democratic voters. But if there was a return to states' rights, and like we're saying that, okay, maybe California, Florida, you know, keep on pumping in the immigrants, but you know that they're not going to stay in Florida and California for long, and eventually they're going to demographically displace all across America. And you know, so that's pretty accurate. We were saying at the beginning, but maybe you could have some sort of strong states' rights, and that could even apply to things like the direction of abortion and gay marriage, or you know, like as I'd mentioned, that you might be able to have places in America where you could have certain states that are basically 100% white, and it becomes much more difficult to buy property and set up for an immigrant in that state. And then you might have blue states where we allow Muslims to set up whole cities of hundreds of thousands of people that operate according to Sharia law. And that, you know, but by be state position, where you wouldn't be able to stop the people in the blue states from moving further in that direction, and we wouldn't be able to stop the red states from being able to further move in that direction. But somehow the union is preserved, and we don't need checkpoints to drive through. And you know, God forbid, my American attitude, libertarian, every time there's like a shooting, even the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, any shooting, say it's tragic, but unfortunately that's the price we pay for freedom here in America. And it's just a sign of the times we live in, the divided nature that we live in, that people are getting killed like that. However, I would rather live with these horrible things happening and freedom than to have my freedom taken away from me. And I'm not sure if you agree with that essential attitude.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I'm mostly on board with the principles of our founding fathers, which I would agree are mostly in alignment with that. It's just I think we need some
I mean, you would occasionally have like terrorists. You would have, you know, white people, God forbid, shooting up you know, urban places and multicultural areas, and you would have you know, suicide bombers and jihad in America. I'm saying if California becomes, you know, just keeps on hoarding in more and more people in Florida, and like I'm saying, let's just let the Muslims set up their own city and operating according to Sharia law. Let's just let the Mexicans create, you know, the section of California they could speak Hispanic and basically self-organize as they want. And we're not going to put a border. You're not going to have a cross checkpoint to go from California to Idaho. And so, you know, it could be that there might be some violence, that you'd have California that through state's law has made a way that they could live in such a way that's completely opposite, you know, Nevada or Idaho or Arizona or any of these Oregon or any of these states. But it still have to be to preserve the union, that people would be able to travel through and do business without going through a checkpoint. They just might have a more difficult time settling there, and the law would be set up in such a way that they probably wouldn't want to live there.
Well, this is what I find interesting is like there are we in America we have a history of this sort of behavior with like sunset laws, etc. And you know, in my own personal life, I've observed my own sunset laws. I'm not going to the black part of town after sundown. Even even during sunrise, there was a especially contentious period of time where there was an escalation of violence within the Black community, and I just avoided them completely. Um, it would have been ideal, in my opinion, if instead of being in the city limits, they had their own city with their own mayor, their own school board, etc. I think that would have been far better than, you know, forcing them to like behave like white people. I think that's disturbing.
I don't know if you're a Jared Taylor fan, but I've heard him mention that, and he's like, yeah, people should be able to have self-determination
Yeah.
and make their own decisions. So people who want to intermarry and be diverse and live in diverse settings should be able to, and people who want to be segregated should be able to. So the pushback has been to disallow segregation in any sense, any place in America, and actively try to break it up through, the Obama administration. I'm not an expert in the policy, but have created certain policies that have allowed immigrants to go into certain places, or to, so to say, forcefully bring different people to different areas, even if there wasn't natural demand for it. So if there's natural demand for people to live in a certain area, and segregation is negatively affecting them, but the policies went so far where it's not natural movement of people, this is unnatural movement of people that has been caused for political purposes.
Oh, yeah, there's been a lot of that. I agree with that. Um, I think what's
I mean,
interesting.
just getting rid of that would be a concession to him. And this current state of America is that bad. We're just getting rid of the unnatural movement of people that is negatively affecting the demographics that you're worried about would be progress for you, let alone allowing you to try to stop the natural movement of people.
Right, absolutely. The the primary concern for me is especially with the diversity and multiculturalism has been the enforced diversity. Like if it was a voluntary thing, I think the landscape and narrative of our people would look a lot different right now. But as is currently, the affirmative action programs, all the various like not just the end of Jim Crow laws, so to speak, but all the various laws that were implemented like on a county by county basis in some instances of like forced integration in schools and things like that. And even when integration was forced, it took a very long time for the homogenous local communities to even start complying with it. So even though it was the law of the land, they still had segregated schools. And what's most fascinating about that to me is what I see in diverse areas such as where you live. There are schools where it's like almost virtually all Black kids. And from what I understand, the system that those kids are participating in is experiencing an increase in dropout rates and crime committed on those schools. Like I kind of look at those schools as like enabling the destruction of Black communities in a way. It's like trying to force them to be something they're not.
Yeah, I'm here in Detroit. I mean, the big issue in Michigan is you're repeatedly tried, taking over the control of the schools in Detroit, because schools in Detroit, so to say, have been failing. And America has been pushing kind of the No Child Left Behind, trying to lift everybody up to the same standards. But it's saying if America allowed pockets of people, and it might include whites, to, so to say, be third world or left behind, where you could have extremely advanced parts of the country where you have top industry and great amounts of wealth, but then other sectors of people would be, so to say, allowed to be less educated, have substantially less amounts of wealth, and still live happily in the country. And that, the same as I was mentioning, would likely apply to the homogenous whites areas, that they would likely become poorer and poorer over time, at least according to my estimation.
Yeah. What I find, okay, so the thing about like the echelons of the white population, the the higher crime, the more degeneracy, etc. Traditionally, from what I've observed through looking at like the different empires and how they manage like the plebs, essentially, my understanding is those people are better off being ruled by their own kind than by a foreign outgroup. So, I find it unfortunate that, like, for example, Detroit, it's the higher income people who flee first, not necessarily like the top 1%, but the upper echelon of the middle class in general, and the upper middle class, that's the group that flees. And the
I would
poor,
disagree. I'm saying that, I mean, they flee the urban area, but they don't flee Metro Detroit because their wealth is dependent. I mean, Detroit is Detroit because of geographical location, being next to the river, and there's a reason why the major city in Detroit is where it is, and you can't really pick up and move the wealth someplace else. So, like, people might move to the suburbs or move further out in the suburbs, but they can't really flee. And as I said, Detroit itself might be 90% African American, but the county it's in is still majority white, and the suburbs are even higher percent white, although they're diverse. And I think most of the whites in Metro Detroit are relatively, they might agree with you to a certain extent, but they know their economic concern is attached to Detroit, and hence have developed a more pro-multicultural, even pro-immigration attitude. I don't think they're going to flee back to the farms.
My argument is that poor whites are less capable of leaving when diversity is imposed upon their territory.
I've been saying if you're an urban person, and saying that the generally the trend is to move from the rural areas to the urban areas, and the urban areas are already very multicultural, and a lot of the urban places across America are already majority non-white. So I think it's unlikely that whites are going to create new cities. Saying that whites, even if you had geographically divided in the states and it was very difficult migration, that whites are going to pick up and create new majority white cities. Like, I don't see any way that happens. So you're looking at the areas that, So what are you going to do if the current areas, the urban areas that are basically already multicultural? It seems almost possible to reverse the trend.
Well, I'm not, like, if people want to live in diversity, go right ahead. There's plenty of places to do it.
You were saying if you want to advance, but saying that whites are going to stand their ground, and saying they didn't flee, they fled the city of Detroit, but they didn't flee Metro Detroit. They just moved to the suburbs, and generally the business interests are still there, and saying they might control the larger corporations that work throughout the suburbs, even though they don't live in the city that they've, so to say, abandoned and left to African Americans, which is a trend across the country.
They'll move to, like, essentially a different government
county.
Yeah, move to a different county, and they'll have like different mayors, not the Detroit mayor. But
they'll have to negotiate with Detroit, because Detroit is the geographic power. The reason Detroit is the major city is related to the river, and geographic reasons. You can't change and put the geographic important center into the suburbs, even though the wealthy people who control the businesses might live in the suburbs.
Sure. But the bulk of the white population is the middle class. And as the middle class leaves a city, it's like bankruptcy, man. It happens slowly over time, and then it happens suddenly. And I certainly see that pattern happen in Detroit. I see the same pattern happening to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, to Sacramento, to Portland, to Seattle. It's there's nothing any of us can do to stop this, man. The white people are leaving, and they're going to be leaving at an ever increasing rate as time goes on, especially as the tax burdens go up. There's more degeneracy in these like liberal strongholds. There's, all the leftist stuff is getting worse, man. They're not going back towards the center.
Would be interesting. I mentioned when President Trump said we need to stop Islamic immigration to America till we figure out, so he said, what the hell is going on? That what if he had said we need to stop immigration, period, total, not just on Muslims, but say we got to figure out what's happening here in America. Until we could figure this out, we're just going to completely close off immigration, period.
Yeah, I fully support that. I assume you support that as well.
Well, I'm apolitical, as I said, which is just a thought that may have sounded more logical than just from a practical perspective. What's politically feasible? Would building the wall, like I favor some sort of negotiated comprehensive immigration reform, and like the 65 Act that basically allows 10,000 from every nation. Even if President Trump, like he said, that it'd be better for America to negotiate trade agreements nation by nation as opposed to having these block agreements, that it could also be immigration would be better off to have negotiated immigration agreements country by country as opposed to a blanket immigration policy.
Yeah, I think that also is in accordance with the spirit of nationalism as well. Bilateral trade agreements, bilateral immigration agreements. I'm fully on board with that. Yeah, absolutely, dude.
And yeah, I'm a big free speech advocate, and unfortunately, it seems there's advantages on both sides to purposely put out misinformation in order to try to win seats, because they figure once they win the seats and it doesn't work, and that's why we have gridlock. That just sort of objectively putting out there what's the current state of policy, what's currently happening, what are the facts to the best of the ability we could decipher the facts, what are the different interest groups that are at play that have different angles in it, and the media relatively does a large disservice, and politicians do a disservice because it's not in their interest to let the people know what's actually happening.
Well, oh man, yeah, absolutely. I find it
as an independent scholar, someone to say, I'm not political, I'm not pushing on either side, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. And it's nearly impossible to, get accurate information. You could read through a bunch of reports, and, like I read mostly think tanks and research on it. And even those have a lot of discrepancies between the information they're, that's saying what's accurate. Just like how many illegal immigrants are there in America? It's we might not even know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right around like 25 to 30 million. That's my guess. But yeah, you're right. We don't know, and I think you're right again. That is a disservice. I think it's unfortunate that certain topics can't be studied, that certain data can't be openly displayed. Like Woes got banned off Twitter for citing the 2017 FBI crime statistics. So it's gotten quite absurd, Dooovid, and it's interesting how a lot of the nationalist positions, like if you just talk about them with people, there's nothing extreme or radical about it, and I think that like this weird portrayal of saying that we're violent while advocating violence against us, it's very childish almost,
To some extent, that's how I got involved in it. It was somewhat like the demonization of Richard Spencer, President Trump, and just looking at it, so like, no, I fully disagree with Richard Spencer, but I think his demonization was inaccurate, and just trying to figure out, like, who is this guy? What's he trying to say? What's he about? And certainly what people are telling me about them is inaccurate. And with the divide, I'm saying, thank God for YouTube, we could have this conversation. But, fortunately, in real life, these conversations are extremely rare. And even on the internet, they might be rare. And even to argue with people or friendly conversations with people, but to allow them to use anonymous names just to, share the insight. We've been at for almost 2 hours. I'm willing to put the link in the chat to see if anyone wants to come on. If you want to call it a night or talk about something, I'll just put the link in the chat. And
I got another hour, dude. This has been great speaking with you.
okay, yeah, I put the link in the chat if anyone is watching and wants to add to the conversation, or fill in or add something to it. And hopefully I don't get a troll. Like if I get a troll like in I've had in the past, then I might have to edit the video, and then I'll lose the chat. But I hope that's not going to happen. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about, or anything interesting to you, related or even unrelated?
Yeah. I was curious what your take on Spencer announcing his bid for the presidency.
I guess for him, it probably makes sense, but I'd say it pretty unlikely. I'm saying, like, I don't see him being able to run as a Republican or third candidate, or even get large amounts of funding. Although he does have national name recognition, but I can't see him. He's going to run against Trump. He's like in a primary as a Republican, and then I heard Luke Ford was playing on his show some of that, and he sounded basically like Bernie Sanders, which was always interesting to me. Like the alt-right, in theory, most of their politics were actually pretty socialist and leftist. A lot of them support things like increasing the minimum wage and national health care and like free education. I thought I heard him saying something like that. And I even joked, it was like, was that Bernie Sanders speaking? Because his politics seemed to be a lot of Bernie Sanders talking points.
Yeah, it is funny how there's a lot of overlap there. But I mean, at this point, man, with the rate of the creation of wealth in this country, man, like ever since 1913, it's got it's gotten a little out of control, with the Federal Reserve printing money. The consolidation of wealth and power has been incredible. I mean, it's truly marvelous when you look at it,
It could be good for the system for him to run and see, really, who does he represent when you question what you're saying. And if what you're saying is accurate, whites have a right to self-determine, but what is really the desire of white people? Do the white people across America really desire to maintain their way of life and and try to fight demographic changes? Or if whites had all the information available, would they not really mind the demographic changes? And I'd mentioned to you offline that I've been moving towards believing in direct democracy, largely based on my experience in lobbying. Well, I'm not a registered lobbying, but just studying issues, that you have one person representing so many people, and they have to make a vote on so many issues. It's really hard to understand. So if you take like Israel, Palestine, just one type thing, where you might not know anything about Israel, never been there, you haven't studied the region. So Israel might fly you to Israel, show you like, where the bombs are going off, and take you to the border, and show you why it's extremely important for you to take the Israeli side of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, although the Palestinians might take you a different side, and you're going to have to go through the whole thought and educational process, and to determine how you vote on different issues. And at the end of the day, it's probably going to be more like money and influence, where you're like, well, I don't really have time to understand these issues or study it. So either you have to have someone give you advice, or you're just going to look what's in your best interest, who writes you a bigger check. And in the reality, Israel-Palestine is actually a small thing when you talk about, in your area, there's probably coal and mineral and natural resources, and technology. Technology is a big thing where it's extremely important. Like you were talking about the electricity grid and solar power, for example, in Michigan, it's illegal to store energy off grid. So if you do have solar or wind power, you're not allowed to store it off grid, largely due to the influence of the major electricity companies, things like health insurance. There's so many different issues that if you did get elected to office, how are you possibly going to make a decision on it? And it's impossible that's not going to lead to corruption. Hence technology, where you could poll people and constantly be having votes on all sorts of issues. And I don't know if you've thought much about the future of direct democracy like that, where you could just, I think Iceland made a pitch toward that, and there's like the Pirate Party or something, but I don't know anywhere else. Elon Musk had mentioned possibly on the Mars, if man ever is on the Mars, what type of system, and he said direct democracy. And I don't know if you think that that's feasible to switch towards some sort of system where people are constantly polled and voting in the computer on all these different issues.
Yeah, or I believe there's a couple of the white Nordic European countries that have digital voting, at least on, I think, on like national ballot measures, which I also find interesting as well. Um, I like the idea of, you know, voting using like the encryption protocols equivalent to banking or whatever. I often say if we trust our money to be transferred digitally, why not our vote? You know, I think they could be just as secure. So,
Well, so, I mean, if you're saying that you strongly believe, I'm saying you may be European in background, but not you don't necessarily have a better view of what Europeans across America desire than I do, even though that's your group. It's conceivable that I could have analyzed it and think actually I think the majority of, so to say, whites in America disagree with you, although there is polling on it. And if people were allowed to vote, so to say, on one issue where you didn't have to select one candidate based on a whole slate of issues, that people might be more willing to step up and show their opinions on these various issues that your relative to major concerns come to be secondary or lower on the list and don't appear at the ballot box.
well, I think it's possible for us to create hybrid systems with a republic type structure that we were, intended for. So, for example, we would elect, as through democracy, we would elect representatives of communities to a bicameral legislator, the House and the Senate, and then they would get, maybe we implement a system where as a nation we vote on like 10 proposals that the Senate makes for ballot initiatives, and then we filter them out and have like a one or two proposals voted on a year or every 4 years or whatever, such as like the legalization of marijuana, or like a comprehensive states rights restoration bill or something like that. um, and then for the populace to be able to vote it and then have our elected representatives ratify it and our president sign it.
Well, what country has voluntarily reshaped its government without disaster? And so, Richard Spencer always said he's picturing America falling apart, and his vision for what happens is largely post the fall of America. And I don't know historically if you could come up with any country that has been able to voluntarily, in the middle of a way of governing, get together, create a constitutional convention, and revamp the government. And I've been talking about that actually for decades, that that's what we need to do. We need to somehow have a new constitutional convention. America has to
Oh,
kind of like slow down and decide who are we, which direction do we want to go.
yeah, I love that idea. I would love a new constitutional convention.
But at the
Um,
same time, that's what we're saying, what about international pressure? So people are, you can't slow down and stop and worry about changing your government, because what about all the international contracts and negotiations and currently operating businesses? And that it's just not the nature of man to be able to do that. And God forbid it's going to be a calamity that only that will bring us down. And only after that calamity happens will we be able to pick up the pieces, those who survive, and try to make a new direction.
well, my hope is, David, that we have advanced enough technologically, intellectually, and hopefully spiritually, to get to a point where we can break this cycle of history and start functioning in ways more harmonious with nature, the environment, and and ideally ourselves. You know, I don't I don't want to see I don't want to see conflict. I don't want to see war. I don't want to see death. I don't want to see destruction. I don't want to see ancient art and civilizations, and I don't want to see any of that get destroyed. You know, I find it to be a tragedy when like old Buddhist monuments are blown up by various partisan groups, I guess you could say. So it, to me, I'm hoping that we have gotten to this point. That's my hope, Dooovid, that there's enough of us capable of averting disaster that start cooperating with one another to actually come towards your concept of universal brotherhood of man, you know, peace, harmony on the planet.
Yeah, I'm more spiritual in general. Is that like generally I put spiritual pursuits above intellectual pursuits and intellectual pursuits above politics. But I think technology will play a big part. Just like presumably me and you know that we exist. And I'm saying from politics, you know that there's someone in the blue states pushing the exact policies that you think are destroying your culture. And people in the blue states know that there's people in the red areas pushing policies that we think are directly in our interest and against our interest. And if you're a politician, you might you go to your state house and have the horrible time of trying to govern and gridlock. And most of the local politicians, they come back and say like, look, there's nothing I could do. What you got to do is call your senators. And I even have these on my YouTube channel. Like that's usually what they say. And it's like, look, the Republicans control the state and the House. There's absolutely nothing you could do about it. What you have to do is get ready for the next elections. You have to call the congressmen. And like I've been hearing that my whole life, and it's saying like it's not working. There's got to be something better.
Yep.
And I assume that's basically what you're saying on your side of the aisle. If you're in Congress and you're like, look, I've tried my best, but there's other people there that disagree, and they're in office, and there's nothing I could do. Like all you could do is fight really hard to win the elections, or just keep pounding and badgering the other people. And unfortunately, these conversations are pretty rare, probably because universities are overwhelmingly liberal, and
all the deplatforming by the corporations.
the corporations and universities are bent on pushing in the more liberal direction. And from their perspective, it doesn't even pay to allow the conversation. But it's easier to just disallow the conversation to take place and keep on subversively pushing in that direction. And but if the masses of society aren't happy with the way that's going, it's going to lead to disaster. And as this conflict goes on, the deficit just keeps on piling on. Even though President Trump complained and complained, the deficit, he just keeps on spending and spending, and the deficit just keeps on getting larger. And any logically minded person is just like, we're headed for disaster. Whether it's civil war, whether it's World War III, or if it's not catastrophic, where it's violence, it's just going to be, America's going to decline. We're not going to be able to fund what we're doing. And Michigan here, I'm a civil engineer by training, and you mentioned some engineering, but our infrastructure is going to crap. I was looking at a recent survey, and like almost everything in America is like C and D level in terms of the current state of the infrastructure.
Yeah, man. What can you call it? The lack of interest in investing in our own selves. It's crazy to me. It's like people supporting politicians who tell them one thing and then do another, and then they vote for them again in the next cycle, all because of what? Like
because you have bad choices. And that's what I really hate the representative democracy system, because in almost every election, basically, I'm a none of the above guy. I don't want any of those people in charge of me. I have so little faith in any of those people to successfully govern. So I don't want any of them. But those are your only choices.
I've been thinking about a system.
On a local level, you say, okay, this is a good man. Like I have on my YouTube pages, And like, I know my local politicians, I'm active, and they're relatively good people. They're nice people. Almost all of them I've been able to get up to, shake hands and address my concerns. They'll at least pretend to listen to my concerns. So I say, okay, they're relatively, the people who end up in office are good people, and but they're just either underqualified or no one's qualified. That, saying one person is beyond their ability to govern us out of this mess.
Well, it's definitely going to be a team effort, you know? I don't see any way around that.
Well, that's
Like,
why we have to have these conversations, because how could we, like Michigan, the issue, like the roads was such a big issue. It was a big election issue. And the woman, Gretchen Whitmore, won, saying that she would increase taxes. You're just looking, you're going to vote for the Republican who wants to give a bunch of tax breaks and is claiming he's going to be able to fix the roads. And she's like, yes, I'm going to increase your taxes, but I'm going to fix the roads. And that was, one of her top 3 issues, fixing the roads. And, from the divide, you're saying like our country's going to hell. We're not going to be able to get along with each other. Let's not even fix the roads. We can't even get together and fix our roads.
well, the problem with this is there really is no easy solution, and I think some amount of entropy is it just is gonna play out. It's like gravity almost, or spinning a coin. Eventually, it's gonna stop spinning.
But we're
And
both students of history, so saying unfortunately, history tells us um, what usually happens is war and mass death and horrible things. So like unfortunately, that's usually how history has dealt with the rise and fall of nations. So we're just looking at, is there any way at all we could avoid what seems to be the inevitable cycle?
well, I think there is, Dooovid. I think more conversations like this, more more actual discussion between figureheads within all the various factions. I mean, that would be a very welcome thing. I have kind of a passion for debates, and one of my favorite series of debates was when Hitchens published his book God Is Not Great, and then when he went around debating everyone. Do you remember that?
Yeah, and in fact, evolution's one. I personally don't believe in evolution, and have watched those and enjoyed those, and even I think Rabbi Shmuley Boteach even debated Hitchens. He debated a bunch of people, including even famous rabbis.
Yeah. Well, but I just want to point out that Hitchens debated like Al Sharpton, Sir Roger Scruton, Dinesh D'Souza. Like, he was all over the map. He would debate with anyone across the spectrum. Like, he almost didn't care. He was willing to step up and have that conversation with them. And I like have like, I wish that environment had flourished rather than gotten stamped out. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, I agree. I mean, that's why I'm doing this and saying like I enjoyed the internet blood sports,
yeah,
but I think possibly just the fact that they were blood sports, people wanted to see one side win. They didn't really want to understand the issues. And to me, like, of course there's people like you out there. Like, I had no doubt that there were people out there like you out there, even though I don't talk with people like you in my day-to-day life, or have the ability to even to have discourse. But I knew there were people like you out there, and that's why I came through YouTube to be able to get into that. And the internet blood sports maybe largely died out because they were more personal attacks, and they were more trying to make it exciting and beat downs, verbal beat downs and destroying people, as opposed like, I don't want to destroy you. I want to lift you up and build a better society with you and come to agreements on these extremely sharp points of disagreement we have, so we could move together, fix our infrastructure, create a better society. However, the blood sports were able to attract huge amounts of people to listen to them, as were conversations like these. And even if the big names like that were doing the blood sports calmed it down to have more peaceful, productive conversations like these, it reaches such a smaller audience. So it's we could keep on doing what we're doing and have these conversations, but the only thing we could do is not give up. But it's hard to imagine the small amount we're doing. And I'm constantly searching YouTube. It's almost interesting that I've been able to converse with hundreds of people across YouTube on these channels. The fact that these people are out there, the technology, you just pop in their chat, and next thing you know, you get a link and you're talking with them. It's almost miraculous.
I think it's wonderful, man. I've always loved that about the internet. Even back when I was a young teenager, man. You remember dial-up modems, and like IRC and all the
Yeah, I was a chess player, and so the first thing I used the internet for was gaming mostly, and mostly chess. But I mean, yeah, it was miraculous, and the new levels of debate, and just looking at this, like the chat, like there's new technology. There's Zoom. There's new abilities that might be able to bring in more people or better organized chats, and this concept of direct democracy we're talking about is going to be largely dependent on technology, which goes back to one of the first things we were talking about was the necessity in bringing high-level immigrants to the country to be able to program these things.
Do you think that technology...
I'm not a coder. I wish I knew how to code. I could look at what we're doing right now and could think like, yeah, there's a lot of things that might be able to advance what we're doing and make it easier, but I wouldn't be able to code it.
Well, yeah, me either. I mean, I can sometimes get the gist of what some of those like autistic nerds with all their coding and scripting say, but
I'm a technology guy. I'm pretty good at using technology and programs and platform, but I'd have 0% chance of being able to code my ideas.
Yeah. Do you think technology will help bridge a divide between nationalists and civic nationalists? And on the same turn, do you think technology would help bridge a divide between, the left and right paradigm, I guess?
But technology is just a tool. But yeah, that's the concept of direct democracy is only possible through technology, and it could be the current technology is not good enough. There'd have to be, I've actually looked into it, like the open source programming. Where's this information to be held? Can you just make everything public? And I've thought, in my libertarianness, I would like to see all of the government secrets, or at least the vast majority of them, like relatively revealed, like the deep state, the millions of people that have government clearance and stuff like that. If they just start declassifying large amounts of things, making it public, having hubs of technology. I mean, living in Detroit, you see like the negative ends, like unfortunately, because of crime and vandalism, it's difficult to create infrastructure. So like I was involved in possibly a company that wanted to install electric car charging stations. But an issue in Detroit is vandalism. You put a bunch of money into putting electric car charging stations in Detroit, and then they get vandalized. It's not going to work. So it'd be the same thing with technology. It's not going to be a miraculous cure, but yeah, I mean, I definitely, I have a background in computer science. Even I just don't know how to program.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's other kinds of technology too, David, like using magnets to influence people's brains that makes them believe less in God and be more open towards diversity.
I don't know. I mean, that might sound. I study technology all the time. I don't think I maybe have heard someone mention that. I don't know if there's actually papers or studies or. I mean, it's possible because I say the corporations have large sums of money, and maybe the best scientists, and if they came up with a way to do that, I wouldn't put it past them that they're actively doing it. Just like people used to tell me, like point to the airplanes in the sky and tell me that they're purposely putting chemicals in the air to combat global warming. And like, I don't know if that's still a conspiracy theory, but I actually, here in Detroit, you see those all the time. You see these planes flying high in the sky with what would appear to be purposely a trail being left behind it. And so I wouldn't put it past that that's actually what's happening. That you're right, but I'm more skeptical of that. More straight engineer. I like to see more proof and evidence.
Yeah, well, I mean, isn't there various instances of regimes using chemistry and biological science to socially engineer their populace. You know?
Well, yeah, and saying even if, and that's why I'm saying the government should do a mass declassification, because I don't really trust the government to be operating in our best interest, especially classified where the government claims to be operating in our best interest, so much so that they can't even tell us what they're doing.
So if I was a senator and you were a senator, you would co-sponsor a bill to audit the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of fiat currency. I don't know, going back to the gold standard, like I was a Ron Paul supporter. I never plan on, like, I'm a religious man. I would never be involved in politics. But if you were a senator and I was, more prominent, lobbyist, I wouldn't be a direct registered lobbyist or something like that. That is something I would support. And I put a lot of thought into the future of the financial system. Well, I think you probably have to go global. The technology has a direct link to globalism.
Have you heard about gold-backed cryptocurrencies, or like Venezuela's proposed cryptocurrency? Have you looked into that at all?
I've read a little bit about it. Like, I don't think the gold standard's practical. I mentioned even years ago as a thought experiment that we could have. I know that the derivatives, like, there's really, people think they have much more money than actually exists. If you look at all the money that people claim to own, it's actually like multiple times higher than the money that's in existence through whatever financial instruments we're using. So it's destined to collapse. That the fiat currency, or however it's worked, that we've just, people artificially think they have money, but in reality, not just like if there was a bank run, but the reality is it doesn't actually exist. That we have to connect it to the resources. And if we could have some sort of, I mentioned to you offline also that socialism appears to work better with the environment. In urban planning, central planning works better through strong centrally controlled governments, although my intuition as a libertarian is against centrally controlled governments. So it seems like a unanswerable paradox, because if you wanted to accurately control what was going on and maximize resources, you would probably want a one world government, although I'm sure we both ideologically oppose the concept of a one world government.
Yeah, 100% not for one world government. Something interesting, Dooovid, about these technologies, including like cryptocurrency, is the concept of like encrypting the entire internet. Kim.com has like proposed this idea. A couple of the other like kind of dissident, Linux types been theorizing about that for a while. So no one central power has access to everyone's personal information.
Yeah, I've actually studied quite a bit of Linux, and I can't code in it. And to some extent, cryptocurrency is basically just Linux. It's just one of the many, blockchain technology is cryptocurrency is just one of the uses of blockchain technology, but there's actually many uses, and it might go from Linux open source versus the corporations. And if you could have I favor transparency. So I mean, obviously there might be need for encryption, and if we lived in a more perfect society, it would probably have to be more transparent. We'd have to increase the trust level. If we kind of know what's going on in the world, we know the resources out there, and we could have global information systems like the programming. I work with the Department of Buildings, where you could have like a map and you could click on a property, and the property will click to the banking statements, the building permits, and all the different governmental information is connected through one map. Are you familiar with those technologies?
Yeah, some of that stuff's really interesting, really cool, and in theory can be quite scary if you
Well, if it was like that, but like transparent, where the whole globe basically had all the information on the tip of their fingers. So even someone in China, someone in the Middle East could click where you live And neither one of us are using our real names, but because that type stuff fears us. We don't know who's watching this, and there's an equal chance that, or maybe even more likely chance, people watching this would be trying to do us harm than help us. But we have to likely move to that sort of transparent society where everybody would know everything about each other. To say, me and my brother, joked years ago, it's even coming up, whether we'd have a chip in our hand at some point, that, just technology, that you would walk in a room and someone would look on their iPhone and they could, look at like a Facebook profile that would include all your pertinent information. And I could see that as the direction of technology, and technology will force us to be transparent and be better actors. But at the same time, God forbid, look what happened with like ISIS or something like that. We saying, oh, if everything was on video, people wouldn't be doing such messed up stuff. But then, what are they doing? They're using live streaming to show people being tortured and murdered. And even here in America, it's constantly people are like, World Star or something. I think they banned Media Takedown and a World Star for showing too much violence. But those were the most popular things on the internet, as far as I understood, pornography and pictures of people getting beat up.
Well, yeah, the unforeseen consequences of what we think is a useful technological advancement.
I mean, human nature is human nature, but so really it's like a paradigm shift. What we have to do is improve the human, and people have to get along and cooperate and work together. And if they do that, probably any system of government could work, or you wouldn't even need so much government, because the private citizens would take care of these issues on their own, and it wouldn't have to fall into the provision of government to handle what we should be taking care of on our own. Like my always feeling on poverty, like I care a lot about helping the poor, but the government has so many restrictions where like you can't open up your place of worship and let homeless people sleep there. That's like against the law. You have to institutionally do it through the government. And so if you want to be a good person in those respects, you can't even do it if you want, besides going through the government. But the reality is most people don't care about it. And if the government didn't do it, no one would do it.
Well, yeah, it's just, they're not going to do it very well. Maybe if your local community leaders had more autonomy over their territory, problems like that would be easy to solve. And hopefully I where it's headed, the futurism of like no privacy, man. I just, maybe there's people who find that. I don't. It kind of fundamentally alters the human experience in the environment and has metaphysical consequences that I don't think we're really talking about to the extent that we should be.
Yeah, well, I appreciate this conversation. Maybe bring it to a close. I know you're on the West Coast, so it's almost 1 o'clock here.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I've been trying to organize conversations like this in real life with almost no success. I remember about over 5 years ago, we actually had an event with an Israeli and a Palestinian where they're, like debating something like that. And I've only remember one of those, but like in terms like politics like this, I've had zero success in organizing in real life debates like this. And although I have, thank God for YouTube, that I've been able to find a venue online, and I'm very happy about it. And even just that me and you could be brought together from huge geographical distance and political differences to share a conversation. I'm grateful for that. I hope people who listen or watch this will gain from it. You can put the comments in the chat. I have Faustian Spirit's YouTube page linked and Twitter linked. Hopefully this is just opening of more conversation and saying, me and Faustian are both relatively in real life, although we're intellectuals and enjoy having these largely intellectual decisions. Both of us are very active in our local regions and trying to do our best to make society better to our understanding. If there's any final words you want to give to, we actually have 18 people, more people watching us now than at any other time. But if there's anything you want to address the audience or to people who later watch this, feel free.
Yeah, Dooovid, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. It's a little different when you like kind of run into one another on on a stream full of other folks, you know, and having the one-on-one conversations I think allows for more room to explore and consider alternative ideas, and I really think that's fundamental towards any kind of progress, you know.
Lifelong education. I saw in university, like the new trend is you can't just train yourself, like Bernie Sanders said, for a little time and then work the same job. These days you have to have a lifelong education. And to me, although I'm always studying, like I don't have the university setting where I have people to talk it over with. So it's only venues like YouTube here to be able to continue our lifetime education and to, improve. You have to help your constituents, and I have to help my constituents. And me and you leading our constituents into war against each other is probably bad for both of them.
Yeah, I don't honestly, Dooovid, I don't think it needs to get to that point. It is my hope that there are enough of us out there to kind of mitigate some of the past trauma, present negative experiences, and future fears, you know. And I I just I want to see more actual exchange across the aisle, so to speak, rather than these ridiculous shouting matches or whatever you want to call it. Like, it can be fun sometimes, but I think it has long-term ramifications that are unproductive for both sides, even if one side kind of feels like they blew the other side out.
Well, those are more fun, like for bigger shows, because as I said, like if it was on a bigger channel, people want to see action. They want to see a winner. Although if any of your friends and associates are interested in having conversations, we could have a bigger panel. And as said, I'm more a research type person, so we talked quite a bit and shared quite a few of our ideas, and largely put our cards on the table, so to say, that why we're doing what we're doing, how we don't feel that we're each other's enemies, even though we're working in different directions and trying to take mind of the possible non-aggression principles, of the negative consequences to other people that our actions might be causing. And that's important, saying that there is action, reaction, there is consequences to our actions. And even to people in my area who are really trying to help out immigrants come here and bring new people, that we should be looking at the consequences of our actions and recognize that there's people on the other side of the issue, and they aren't necessarily bad people, that they're logical and they might be compassionate, and just have different interests that we might not know without actually talking with them.
Yeah, well, if something is negatively affecting a person or a group of people and they don't voice their concerns and the reality of what's happening to them, then no one's going to hear them, you know. And so being the tough guy and like kind of taking it and struggling through it sometimes isn't always the best option. And I think Dooovid is kind of in many ways proof positive that there are always individuals within a collective, and hopefully the people who dedicate themselves to the pursuit of knowledge, truth, whatever you want to call it, hopefully they cross paths with one another, and good things can come of that. I've seen that throughout history. I've experienced that in my personal life. I don't really see how this YouTube space is any different, you know. So I appreciate your time, dude.
Okay, and just before I end the stream, I'll mention I tried to look at the chat, but I didn't read all the chat. But I will rewatch the video and look through all the chat. And if anyone wants to leave comments, I'll do my best to respond. And as usual, by maybe tonight or in the next day or two, I'll rewatch the video and timestamp a table of contents, so that if people just want to watch parts of it or go back on different parts, that there'll be some sort of table of contents that relates to the different topics we talked about in timestamps. So you could just click on that and it'll instantly take you to that point in the video. So have a great night, everybody. And I really appreciate Faustian Spirit for taking the initiative to reach out to me on Twitter and then you request this conversation. And, maybe it'll be the first of many conversations. We'll see what the response is to it. So have a great night, everyone.